So, hello and welcome to the NFDI talk. My name is Cord Villiers and I will moderate today's session. The talk will be live streamed to YouTube and also saved on our YouTube channel for later viewing. After the talk, we invite you to ask questions and to discuss the topics. However, this interactive part will not be recorded and also not be streamed to YouTube. In today's talk, Dr. Till Grallert will present open tool registries, resolving the directory paradox with Wikidata. That definitely sounds interesting. Till Grallert is a social and media historian of the Arabic-speaking Eastern Mediterranean from the 19th century to the present. He currently heads the Methods Innovation Lab for Digital History at Humboldt-University, Berlin, as part of NFDI for Memory's effort to foster a critical and practical data culture within historical disciplines. His work focuses on the affordances and the epistemic violence of the digital for the societies of the global South. Thank you, Till. Okay, good. Then now, Till, thank you for being here and giving us the talk. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's a great pleasure. I'm looking forward to this presentation. As you can imagine, I will not be talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, but rather something more particular to the endeavor of the NFDI, the Nationale Research Data Infrastructure. I start sharing my screen. That should take just a couple of seconds, and it should work, does it? Yeah, it seems so. Okay, so today's talk is titled Open Tool Registries, and we are aiming at resolving the directory paradox with Wikidata.
Sorry for interrupting, yeah. Till. We seem to have a problem with streaming to YouTube. It does not appear to start. So I will, just to be sure, I will also record this here. So please, I will just start the recording here.
Okay.
And now, please continue. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, never mind. So once again, I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for the very generous introduction and for giving me the time to talk about something that is very dear to my heart. Today's talk is titled Open Tool Registries. It's more call to action than actually description of what we're doing, or rather we're just presenting one of the possible examples of realizing this call to action. And I will start with a very quick summary of what you can expect in the talk and in the larger project. So basically, we are arguing that we do indeed solve the directory paradox. We have a number of achievements to our name. We would argue that we opened a data set of more than 1,600 software tools, published them as linked open data to Wikidata. We saved a version data set to Zenodo. We publish and develop open data models for classifying software tools with the Tardira taxonomy, and provide meaningful ways of curating tool registries, as well as providing a front-end module. We're operating under a certain set of constraints. Of course, nothing is difficult if you have sufficient funding and personnel. So that not being the case, there are severe constraints. One being that, of course, the Nationale Forschungsdateninfrastruktur is a project-funded endeavor, and the concrete team implementing this tool registry is a rather small one of 2 researchers, 2 research software engineers, and 2 students assistants, all working part-time on this particular project and on fixed-term contracts. And my talk will consist of, by and large, these points. I will briefly introduce who we are, both as a small team and the larger NFDI for Memory Consortium. And then I will talk about our proposal to indeed publish a tool registry on Wikidata by addressing it through minimal computing approaches. I will talk about Wikidata, our data models, the data set itself, and the necessary interfaces to actually make that usable to our colleagues in the historically oriented humanities. With that said, I would like to start introducing ourselves. Who are we? Well, oh, sorry, that was a bit too quick. We are the Consortium for Memory, which is the largest, to my knowledge, the largest consortium within the larger NFDI infrastructure. It has 11 co-applicant institutions, from universities to research institutes to libraries, archives, and professional association, der Verband der Historikerinnen und Historiker in Deutschland. And it's not just a large number of co-applicants, it's also a huge number of participant institutions. And even though it doesn't really make sense to put them on the world map, to be honest, because most of them are located in Germany, you can see that these are 80 plus institutions. So it's a behemoth of a consortium. Within that larger consortium structure, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, given that this is an NFDI talk, we are organized into task areas as so many other consortia. And as you can see, you have task areas for data quality, for data connectivity, for data services, for data literacy, and data culture, all tied together by an umbrella task area for that's steering and coordinating the consortium located at the Leibniz-Institut für Europäische Geschichte in Mainz. And when I talk about we are the task area data culture, which is a shared endeavor of the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin and der Verband der Historikerinnen und Historiker in Deutschland in Frankfurt. And to the right, you can see the team that is involved in this task area, both located in Frankfurt and here in Berlin. And what do we mean when we talk about data culture? Well, first of all, we argue that, or we operate from the premise that we do live in datafied societies, which means at the point of contact, all historical cultural data has already been remediated by communication and information infrastructures, right? Be it a library catalog. They simply thought there is no unmediated access to historical sources. We have to go through means of communication that are already thoroughly datafied and that which do have an impact on what we can see, find, formulate, formalize, etc. And within that larger framework of living in datafied societies and thus having to deal with datafied knowledge making or Wissenschaft in a way, we argue that we have a new episteme in which algorithms are part of the social fabric, right? They have agency. Human actions are engendered by algorithmic decision making, whether we know it or not, whether we want it or not. And we argue that we have to address this new episteme if we want to continue to do scholarship, science, Wissenschaft, right? Even if it's only accessing a library catalog, you have to be intimately familiar with search algorithms. Even if you're only using Word as a writing environment, you have to be familiar with the impact of large language models that are nowadays forced upon us, right? So we strive for the necessary cultural change within the historically oriented disciplines. And to that end, the task area data culture is engaging in all sorts of measures. And I'll just give you a very brief overview of a few of them. One pillar is, of course, ethical and legal considerations of the digital, if you want. And this, of course, is a cross-consortial endeavor where all the task areas work together, but it's coordinated by the task area data culture. We also strive into community building and discussing these important epistemological and methodological questions with the larger community, and not just the local community, not just the German or German-speaking community, but the international community of historians who happen to be engaging with digital data sets and computational tools. And I listed a few of these endeavors here, and you can click on them. I will share these slides in the aftermath of the talk, and then the links will be live and working. We also have a large early career support network. There is a graduate network that's meeting next week in retreat. We have fair data fellowships. There will be an info meeting that you can join on 4th of November. And there's a number of early career travel grants for doctoral students and early career postdocs. That said, let's delve into the directory paradox, right? Why tool registries and what is it, the directory paradox? Well, obviously, tool registries serve evident needs, not just in the humanities, but in scholarship and science in general. On the one hand, we do need authority files. We need a description, an authoritative description of which tools and methods have been used in a particular research project to answer a specific question. We have to know what are the implications and consequences of using and applying that method to a specific question and a specific a corpus or data set. So one main function of tool registries is being an authority file. And the other one is there's a need for curated lists of a tradition of a field's knowledge, of preserving that archive of a field's knowledge. What has been used in the past? Where can I find additional information? What can this tool be used for, right? A classification task. And also, is it useful for the actual research question, or is it just the latest, fashion that is followed here? And to the left, you see one of these word clouds that was just generated from papers submitted to the ATHO annual DH conference, which have been classified by the authors, and trying to see which tools were actually deployed in these papers. And you see, it's a very fuzzy notion of tools, and we come to that in a moment. So consequently, tool registries have proliferated in the digital humanities, and they are a genre of their own. And you have this sort of succession of projects. There is this famous TAPO registry, which is the text analysis portal for research, Canadian endeavor. There is nowadays the Social Sciences and Humanities Open Marketplace, part of the European Open Science Cloud, funded originally by Daria, Clarion, etc. There's a lot of acronyms immediately, but there's also various NFDI consortia which are producing these registries, this overview of a field's techne, right? And I listed a few of them here. But there is a fundamental problem with all these endeavors, which was framed by Quinn Dombrowski, who's a librarian at Stanford University, as the director paradox a couple of years ago, basically arguing that all of these endeavors are ultimately doomed to fail. If at all you can provide a historical data set, so to speak, a snapshot of a particular moment in time, it's not even an entire holistic field, but like a singular snapshot, given that most of them are funded through project funding. And if I want to have a continued record of a field's practices, that is a conflicting affordance, right? In consequence, we have technical infrastructures that focus on proprietary and custom technology stacks. We have a focus on presentation layers because that's what funders appreciate, right? It's not so much the underlying infrastructure, but a shiny website. Oftentimes, you do see no or very badly documented application programming interfaces. So you have siloed data that cannot readily be accessed from outside, and which cannot ultimately act as an authority record because there is not just a resolving URL, but there's also an URL. There's no URI. There is no unique identifier that you could use in linked open data environments in many instances. And more importantly, is the human infrastructure, right? It's a field's knowledge, and this knowledge is embodied in our colleagues. And usually they're organized because it's coming frequently from a library tradition. It's organized in hierarchies of knowledge and expertise. So it's not necessarily the people who are most impacted by using these tools or who are the most advanced users of the tools who are allowed to edit information on these tools. And how to access that knowledge would be our question. Who should describe it? And through how many hoops do you have to jump to get that information recorded in the directory? That all hinges upon community engagement, which again, with project funding, is incredibly difficult to sustain, right? It runs for a couple of months probably, but then you simply do not have the labor hours to commit to this sort of continued community engagement. So this very briefly is the directory paradox. Now I could stop the talk at this moment and say, okay, we're done with registries. Let's not do it. It's a bad idea. We could record historical practice, but let's keep it with that. Instead, we say, no, we yet propose another standard. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this comic strip. It seems to be a ridiculous idea. And I'm trying to spend the rest of this talk to convince you that it's not as ridiculous as it seems to be at the first glance. So basically, what we argue is that we have to accept the constraints under which we operate. And that means do it yourself, keep it simple, and don't do it alone. And there are a few initiatives that I wanted to highlight here. One is the Minimal Computing Working Group of ATO, the Association of Digital Humanities Organizations. Another one is the Endings Project at the University of Victoria, which formulated principles how to sustain and how to start projects by thinking about their end and already factoring in all the requirements for ending a project at the very project start. And finally, the Digital Humanities Climate Coalition, which argues that we're in fact living in a poly-crisis environment where we burn our planet. So expanding very limited resources in unsustainable ways is, of course, out of question. And with that, I briefly want to talk about minimal computing. It's basically a very simple idea, put forward in the mid-2010s by scholars focusing on the Caribbean and Latin studies in the United States. One of them being Alex Krill, nowadays at Yale, and Erika Ortega, who basically said, quote, that we have to learn how to produce, disseminate, and preserve digital scholarship ourselves. Without the help we cannot get, and even as we fight to build the infrastructures we need at the intersection of and beyond institutional libraries and schools. And I think this is something we should really take to heart when we are building infrastructures. So it's centered on the question of we and who is we. We'd argue that this community is defined by shared interests, shared values, shared ethics. In our case, that's obviously fair data, but it's also, when we think about indigenous data, it's the care principles that we need to acknowledge. We should care for the digital commons, all the unmentioned and unappreciated labor that's going into these infrastructures. And from that sort of set of basic convictions, this we also defines the specific context and the working conditions under which we operate, our access to skills embodied again in people, methods, labor time, tools, money, etc., etc. And again, even though we are a well-funded consortium, it's still very limited if we compare to, the large tech giants in our world, right? Be it Meta, be it Google, etc. So minimal here, it doesn't mean minimal from the position of privilege as a luxury item. We're all aware of Marie Kondo, probably, and these very fancy luxury kitchens. This is wasting resources that are already at hand, right? You have a large flat. Instead, we suggest the metaphor of the Frankfurter Küche, where you make best use of a very limited space with the materials at hand, utilizing the labor and the skills that we already have access to. And thus, even though it's called computing, our focus is mainly, or we argue for a focus on people, training, keeping these people, providing them with the necessary income, so to speak. So trying to put together positions that are long-term positions in order to invest and foster in this sort of developing skills and knowledge environment. It's not so much, yes, of course, we do need computers, we do need hardware, but we cannot only depend on that hardware because it needs people to run it, right? We all know that. It needs electricity that has to be paid for, etc. So we're trying to address the directory paradox through minimal computing. And very briefly, our design decisions and requirements on these two fronts of, on the one hand, data creation. We want to create lists of tools, and we do have some sort of technical constraints that we want to address. So on the one hand, we want to have an open and crowdsourced data curation process because we want to give the people who are concerned with these tools and the application of these tools ownership and agency in this process. We also only want to provide a very minimal data model, something that everybody can agree on, and then you can attach bits and pieces on top of it while maintaining the minimal model in order to ensure interoperability of your data sets. And of course, we do not want to reinvent the wheel. There's so many knowledge collected about software that we do not have to record again. So we want to retain and build on existing data sets. Basically, follow the lead of all these other tool registries in copying data from Dirt to Bamboo to Taupo to the social sciences and humanities open marketplace, and in our case now to Wikidata. In terms of technical infrastructure, we made a commitment of focusing on existing infrastructures with a proven track record, open standards and public domain licenses when we talk about data and data serializations. We need to have stable and versioned identifiers for data in order for it to be and serve as an authority file. And we have to value the user base and value user friendliness over technical purity. That means, yes, and we will come to that in a moment, I guess, even though there's not a formal ontology, Wikidata has a huge user base. And in our case, we decided this is more important for us. This might not be the right thing for everybody, but for our use case, that was the right decision. And of course, we need to separate content and data on the one hand and the interfaces. We have to make this data interoperable independently from the user interface. And with that, we come to our main infrastructure decision, that is choosing and opting for Wikidata. Wikidata, and I'm sure everybody's aware of that, is part of the Wikiverse run by the Wikimedia Foundation, brainchild of Wikimedia Germany, established in 2012, I think, in order to be the structured knowledge graph backbone of the Wikipedia, to provide structured references for all the knowledge contained within Wikipedia and its sister projects. In terms of data, it satisfies the 5-star linked open data conditions set out by Tim Berners-Lee. I'm not going to read them out, they are on the slide here. In terms of community, again, something that we deeply value, it has a proven track record. It's part of the Wikiverse and the Wikimedia Foundation. It's not as large as Wikipedia, to be honest, but still it has a substantial community of contributors and editors. By today's counting, it's more than 20,000. Of course, I'd say only 1,000 are actually active, but that's a substantial, far beyond anything we could ever reach if we built it ourselves, right? And there's also a large number of bots contributing linked data from linked sources. In our case, we're interested in software. A lot of software is, or at least the source code is shared on code sharing platforms, GitHub being one, hopefully lesser in the future, but at the time it still is. And there are plenty of bots who are crawling GitHub and contributing version numbers, releases, dates, licenses, etc., without any human interference. You only need to provide the link once, and data will be updated. And this is already a huge benefit over the existing Tool Registries. It has established codes of conduct, there is formulated best practices, and there is a high visibility. If you go into the common search engines, even though they are not very much good for finding anything anymore, Wikidata will rank very highly on these search engines. Again, that's opposed to anything we could ever dream building, even with our substantial funding at hand. And it's increasingly used by GLAM institutions for recording their collections. As a platform, it uses and provides free and open source software. It has an elaborate user management, version control. It has APIs. It has SPARQL endpoints. And for those of you who think, what the heck might be SPARQL, I'll come to that in a moment. And from a personal point of view, it's a huge benefit is that the entire platform is multilingual throughout. That means it supports all scripts supported by Unicode, and it has already more than 190 language versions based on the very same data set. Again, that's something we can only dream of achieving in building our own infrastructure. So that's the platform we choose. In terms of data models, we argue, first of all data, of course, is modeled. There's no such thing as raw data, and I provided these very well-known quotes and citations for that point. The only thing you need to know is what was the purpose the data was gathered for, what is it supposed to represent in real-world terms, and what are the limitations of the very specific data model, right? And then you have to negotiate trade-offs for any given project at the end of the day. And this is something that historians frequently do not think of. We are not trained to think about the world in terms of modeling, even though we have very intricate models, we do not call it like that. So this is meant to say that, yes, historians model all the time, and yes, we do model our tools and methods, of course. And in this case, our conceptual data model is very rudimentary. It basically says all computation research tools are combinations of methods and software. Methods are informed by theories, and they do have a purpose. They are meant to serve a specific research question. These methods are necessarily implemented through multiple layers of software. Software then requires hardware, middleware, infrastructure resources, electricity, internet, licenses, etc. And software interacts with data formats in their civilizations. And this is what we're concerned with. The registry is concerned with software and linking software to methods. How to implement that on Wikidata, given that it's very famously, or rather infamously, referred to as a folksonomy, something that is made up while you go. There's no ontology, and if you talk to librarians, this is a no-go, right? That's something unimaginable. There's no ontology behind it. It's very basic generic data models, but it's a linked open data model. It has items, these describe entities. The description is done with statements formulated as properties with values, and all these statements can carry qualifiers specifying particular qualities of that statement and references to external sources. Very limited, very basic data model, but a very helpful one. And provenance is something that historians do value. So the emphasis on referencing is something deeply appreciated by us historians. Within that framework, we conceptualize software in this, and provided an example here, that we have items which are software and they have a certain use. And here's the source where you can find more about them. That's basically our data model. You see a formalization in these terms that might or might not be familiar to you with these different namespaces in the Wikidata knowledge graph. So you have the blue ones with the Q numbers. These are the items. Then you have properties such as labels. So they all have a name. They can have names in different languages. They are linked to the left with the property P9309 to methods, other items that are then linked to a taxonomy, and through which we tie together our registry. And of course, the most important bit in this data model is classification. We have to organize items in the registry by some means in order to file them, in order to retrieve them, in order to produce knowledge about tools and tool usage. And one means of classifying is the taxonomy of digital research activities in the humanities, or short TADIRA. And I guess most people who heard the term hate TADIRA, and probably for good reasons. But it's the only accepted taxonomy that exists in the field of digital humanities. It's the only one that's actually applied. It's the only one that you can find in the real world out there. And it's the one that has already been implemented in existing tool registries. So accepting that state of things, we chose to go with TADIRA, arguing that the infrastructure and the data model is open, of course, to any other classification system that you could think of. You only have to find a way of modeling the taxonomy in Wikidata through some sort of same as statements. It's very simple. That is nothing that is a technical restriction on the entire system. It's just a curatorial decision to go for TADIRA because that's the accepted taxonomy in the field, despite its limitations. One of them being, again, it's project funded. So development is up and down, up and down. It's very imperfect, of course, to model quickly evolving methods, but that's true for any taxonomy. They will always lag behind what is cutting edge. There is no classification yet for cutting edge methods, obviously. And unfortunately, it is very particular to TADIRA. There are incompatible versions out there in the wild, and knowledge about them being different versions is not as widely distributed as the taxonomy itself. And unfortunately, they're incompatible. So it has to be taken with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, I provided you with a number of examples of platforms that are using that taxonomy already. We also provide ways of extending the data model, right? Remember that we said we only provide a basic data model, and now you can attach things to it depending on your project needs. And one is, of course, active curation. we not only want to find all software classified with Tadira, we want to make explicit statement that this is a tool of importance to us. And this is a very simple thing to do, basically using a single statement linking the software to another Wikidata item for your registry. And in the case of our dataset, we did model tools belonging to either the Social Sciences Humanities Open Marketplace or the TAPO registry through this collection property that you see here. And to the left is a live call to the Wikidata SPARQL query, and it shows you the number of items in these particular collections. Another extension that you can readily think of course, is once you start classifying tools, you can add classification of research output, you can make assumptions on potential tool use. Of course, this is heavily limited by both the data set, i.e. the state of recording in Wikidata. It's not a perfect world, it's an open world. It's not even clear if it's representative of the field as such, but you can start poking around. Keep in mind that one of the main purposes of tool registries is guiding colleagues towards tools and knowledge about tools. And that might be a meaningful approach, saying, well, we have these and those scholars who did have presentations employing specific methods. Probably they used a tool that was part of this method and that is implementing this method. So it might be worthwhile talking to your colleague at your institution. And this is currently based on another data set that we added to Wikidata, which is the conference presentations at the Digital Humanities conferences in the German-speaking countries. So this is heavily biased towards digital humanities, which serves our purpose, but if you come from engineering, you need to think about other assumptions. But that leads me to the question of data and data sets. How did we, well, where does the data come from? I already said so. We followed the lead of other tool registries and added existing knowledge about tools based on existing registries to Wikidata. We ingested the data. We did map the missing Tadira classes to Wikidata. And of course, we continue using it in our daily work. So there's a for memory help desk. If we talk about tools, we add them to Wikidata and link them to Tadira classes. I already mentioned bots adding information on individual tools. And there's a huge community who is adding data without knowing so, right? Because they add information on software. And occasionally they happen to use Tadira classes for classifying them. And immediately it becomes part of our shared knowledge about tool usage. And there are tens of thousands of items describing software on Wikidata. There are more than 10,000 which also have a used for property statement, but then less than 2,000 of them are actually pointing to Tadira classes. So you see there's a much larger body of knowledge already present on Wikidata, and probably need to think about how to harvest that, how to model what is already there and make it commensurate with our classification schemes. One big issue with Wikidata, of course, is everybody can edit it. And that's something that we are wary of as scholars, as librarians. Even though when we talked to Wikimedia Germany, they were like, yeah, Wikidata doesn't really have a vandalism problem like Wikipedia does. The hugest problem is guys like you from glamour institutions who are adding hundreds of thousands of items without first reconciliating your new data set with existing data and thus creating duplicates. Nevertheless, we said, okay, yes, Wikidata, like any infrastructure, will come to an end eventually, at some point in the future, even though it's more durable than NFDI for memory, arguably. So what we do is through a combination of bash scripts, SPARQL queries, and API calls, we download parts of the knowledge graph that is Wikidata, i.e. information of tools and their nearest neighbors, and then release them in regular intervals as a version dataset on Zenodo. Currently, that's weekly snapshots. It's not big data by any means, so we're confident we can keep that up without jamming servers in any way. But And this is the last point. I guess you already heard SPARQL, and those of you familiar with SPARQL, I suspect you to be wary of us relying on SPARQL, given that's a query language. And probably I skipped that slide for a moment, because that is not a language that's familiar to most historians and scholars in the humanities. It's very powerful. We all know that it's a query language. You can make intricate queries to the data set. It allows you to tie things together, which are otherwise invisible through the graphical user interface. But that is a language to learn. And one way around that would be building additional interfaces onto the back end that is Wikidata. And there are already existing initiatives doing that. There are people who are saying, no, we need a richer view of what is already present in Wikidata. One on the left, I provided you an example of the resonator, which tries to present it in a more accessible way, adding more data than is visible in the linked data interface provided by Wikidata. On the right-hand side is an initiative that you should all know of. It's Scholia, which provides mostly based on SPARQL queries and wrapping them in a larger JavaScript-based interface, which allows very intricate views into the data set, but with a specific focus on scholarship and science. And what we did is we just thought, okay, we can do the same, right? If that's possible, let's do it ourselves. And we also built a very basic interface as a proof of concept in demonstrating that the argument is indeed feasible. We can build a simple, fully static local website that is based on daily data dumps from Wikidata, which we pull daily through the Wikidata APIs, and then present it in a dynamic seeming but static interface, and thus can be run without an internet connection, for instance, which can easily be archived, which provides a sort of search interface that is not otherwise available if you only use Wikidata online as through the graphical user interface. And it has the added advantage, of course, that you can brand it, you can engage in data selection, but it's of course important to our funders that we provide their logos onto what we are doing in order to increase the visibility of these very worthwhile endeavors. And just briefly, because I skipped over it, I wanted to show you the limitations of the linked data interface, which you can see here. It's the entry for Gephi, a software for visual network analysis. And as you can see, it emphasizes editing data. You can immediately jump and edit stuff. And there's no restrictions on editing apart from ranges of IPs which are blocked because they belong to VPN services. But otherwise, you can directly edit without even a user account. What you cannot easily see is what I'm talking about, right? That Gephi might be found in a collection, that it is part of a tool registry, that it has a certain purpose, even though if I scroll down here, you can see, yes, it has these has-you records here, but there's no easy way of finding all the tools that can be used for network analysis. For that, you either need SPARQL, which can nowadays write with LLMs, at least there are first experiments for doing so, or use our custom interface, or build your own, right? And with that, I come to a brief conclusion. It's basically a repetition of what I mentioned at the onset of the talk. We are operating under a set of constraints. And this is important to mention. Of course, our solution is specific to the constraints we operate under. We do argue that we mostly solve the directory paradox by using Wikidata for curated collections. And these do not necessarily have to be limited to tools. You could think of artworks, etc., or periodicals, you name it. And there are a substantial number of achievements. We created an open data set under public domain licensing of more than 1,600 software tools available on Wikidata as linked open data in an RDF dump on Zenodo. We provide a front-end module and we provide data models, which are again open to discussion and development through the community. And with that, I want to acknowledge the support from our funders and thank you all for listening to me. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Till. Great talk. Now, before we start the question discussion session, we say goodbye to our viewers on YouTube. The next regular NFDI talk then will take place on October the 20th, so in 2 weeks. In this talk, Ingrid and NFDI for Ing will give an introduction to the Ingrid Journal for Fair Data Management in Engineering Sciences. And then I have a special announcement that in addition to this talk, next week, and not on Monday, but on Tuesday, we will have our first NFDI talk special. That is because October the 14th, next week's Tuesday, is the International World Standards Day. And on this occasion, we will have a talk by Naira Danalyan and Hermann Behrens from DIN. And they will present insights into the work of DIN in their standardization work, and also by Thorsten Trippel of TextPlus, who will present a use case of standards in linguistics. The session of the NFDI talk will be in German. You can find more info on the events section of our website and also on the YouTube channel after this talk here. So now I will stop the stream. This will take also stop recording here.